네, 다음으로 오후 두 번째 기조 강연으로 들어가 보도록 하겠습니다. 캐시 조 마틴 보스턴대학교 정치학 교수님께서 불평등 치유 가능하다라는 주제의 기조 강연 해 주시겠습니다. 캐시 조 마틴 교수님을 큰 박수로 무대로 모시겠습니다.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you so much. Is the mic on? Okay, thank you so much for inviting me today. I want to thank Mr. Yang Song Woo, Mr. Kim Jong-gu, and Mr. Lee Chang-gong. Thank you so much for including me in this extremely interesting and thought-provoking opportunity to talk about inequality. Now, I'd like to start with a vignette. So in 2006, my husband argued the major environmental case in front of the US Supreme Court. The case was called Massachusetts versus EPA, and the New York Times called it the most important case of the century. It was a great triumph. We won. Massachusetts won. It laid the basis for Obama to form the Clean Power Plan, and everything was great until Trump started to dismantle the whole thing. So I bring that up not to brag about him, although I do like to brag about him. I used to tell people in grocery store lines right after the victory happened, but to talk about an experience that I had that morning in the US Supreme Court as my husband was about to face Anthony Scalia and the other Supreme Court justices. I was so nervous that I would have talked to Attila the Hun if he'd been the only person available. And instead they put me next to the automobile industry. So as you know, lobbyists for the automobile industry are nice guys because they're lobbyists. And so we struck up a conversation, and they were very pleasant to me and trying to calm me down. And at the end of it, one of the guys, one of these lobbyists on the other side, turns around after my husband finishes and goes. And I looked at him and I said, wait a minute, we're supposed to be on the other side, on different sides. And he said to me, we don't care who wins or loses. We make money either way. And I thought to myself, that's the problem with American business. So I also want to say thank you so much to the organizers of this event for not making me talk about the United States and American business. Instead, I get to talk about the Nordic countries and some successful examples of how business might be interested in dealing with the problems of inequality. So I have several points today. The first question is, when do employers in fact care about inequality? What are the circumstances under which they are concerned to do something about inequality? And I'm going to argue to you that it largely has to do with when employers see social investment as something that's linked to economic growth. That in fact it's in their interests to support social investments. Now, second question is, when do employers endorse these social investments? And I would suggest to you that the main reason they endorse social investments is because they view social investments as something that's going to strengthen society. That it's not about individuals, it's not about charity, it's not about fixing the plight of the long-term unemployed and marginal workers. Instead, it's about building a strong society. And the third question has to do with how we sustain social investment and what we might call growth with equality in a post-industrial world. And here I would suggest to you that growth regimes with high value-added sectors have higher levels of social investments. That in fact, when you can move into growth that is in value-added niches, high value-added niches, you're more likely to get strong welfare states, equality, social solidarity, et cetera. And that finally, nations with higher levels of labor market coordination can restructure more easily and move into these growth sectors. So what that all means is that sometimes the best way to get to inequality is not to make arguments directly in emphasizing inequality. For example, in the Nordic case, the language is not about fixing inequality or redistribution. It's about building a strong society. And this has a lot of implications. For example, I would suggest to you that right-wing populism in America today is thriving because it's made claims on society. That in the United States, the people on the right are making arguments about society, whereas people on the left are making arguments about identity politics. Now, all countries aren't like the Nordic countries, that's for sure. But we all have certain kinds of traditions of collectivism upon which we can build these new political messages. And so what I want you to think about, and what I'd like to think about with you, is how South Korea can tap into the traditions of collectivism that before the era of neoliberalism seemed to help direct social investment, and how we can reclaim that lost ground. Okay, so the first set of questions is, when do firms get social policies? When do they care about the social world? And I would suggest to you that firms want a lot of things. They want profits, but they also want labor peace. They also want influence into the policy-making process. They want control. They want their own way. They also want to compete in value-added markets, high value-added markets. They want worker skills and productivity. And at times, they also want to even invest in the long-term unemployed and other marginal workers. So the social investment strategy is something that's possible. And in fact, there's something called the social investment model that people have developed. So Gösta Esping-Andersen talks about this, Maurizio Ferrara talks about this, the Europe 2020 is built on this social investment model. And the idea of this model is that programs nurture capacities of workers. They enable citizens to contribute to society. In this model, there's a strong link between welfare and work. The idea is to prevent social risks in advance, so these countries that embrace the social investment model tend to invest a lot in children. For example, in the United States, our ratio of spending on children to spending on the elderly, spending on the elderly to spending on children is 38 to 1. We spend $38 on the elderly for every dollar we spend on children. In Sweden, it's 6 to 1. So they still spend more on the elderly, but the ratio is much smaller. This entails spending on education and training and early childhood development, active labor market policies to get the long-term unemployed back into the core economy. Very close to what President Moon has been talking about with his idea of an inclusive society. Policies that reconcile family and work, that encourage female labor force participation. These often have an emphasis on social innovation. Now, I just want to show you this slide, which is not mine, but is from Maurizio Ferraro, which I think is quite interesting. And if you see, the y-axis is, I think it's the y-axis, is investment-oriented social spending. And the left, the x-axis is 20 to 60-year-old, just a minute. Is more investment in social spending, and the y-axis is employment among 20 to 64-year-olds. So what you can see is the more social spending you have, the more employment you have. Now, there's a big question, though, about when you can get firms to actually endorse this model. If you think about it, employers have a range of interests that they might possibly act upon. And so the question is, when will companies define their interests as consistent with the social investment model? How do firms decide to form their preferences? Why do they decide to invest in workers? And I think there's several different reasons for that. And the first reason is that social investment has often deep cultural roots. This is from work that I have been doing on literature and public policy to try to understand culture. Culture tends to be an error term in social science. And so I've been trying to think about a way to understand culture. And so what I've done is I've taken literature in different countries. I've constructed corpora of literature, about 550 in each country. And here I'm going to talk about Denmark and Britain. And what I've done with this literature is to take snippets of text around words like poverty and education, a variety of different dimensions, and then look at the topics and kinds of words that appear in these snippets of text. And what I've found is that in Denmark, the Danes believe, and this goes back to 1700 to 1920 are my years, the Danes believe that poverty is a problem for society because it detracts from the social fabric, because it means that not every single individual is giving back to society. Whereas in Britain, poverty is a matter of individuals. And so we should help these individuals because we care about them, we care about charity, but we don't think about it in terms of society. And so if you look at the next slide, this is I think, a really interesting slide. And these are words about skills and capacities in Denmark, Britain, and France surrounding poverty words. And so the Danish ones are the turquoise. And so way back to 1680 to 1760, the Danes thought about poverty in terms of capacities and skills and ability to give back to society. Whereas in France, which is the dark red one, they don't really care about that at all. Another case in point, society words in these snippets of text in Denmark are much higher than in Britain or France. Now, charity words in this slide have a very different kind of story. So charity words are high in Britain and France, which are the green and the yellow ones, but the Danes don't really think about charity at all. Charity doesn't really come into it until the latter part of the 19th century. So for Denmark, social investment in poverty and in education is very much connected to building a strong society. Now, what does this mean? Oh, final slide, individual words. And again, they're highest in Britain and much lower in the light blue of Denmark. So this is one reason why some of these countries have higher levels of social investment. And there's not much we can do about the historical story, but what it suggests is when you frame messages in terms of social investment, you tend to get a stronger commitment to action than when you simply frame messages in terms of redistribution. Now, a second factor that matters historically has to do with the organization of business and labor, the organization of industrial relations systems. So you have, sometime in the 19th century, in a lot of countries, you start getting institutions for labor market coordination. And there are lots of reasons why these institutions form. Some of it has to do with labor movements. Some of it has to do with traditional guilds. Some of it has to do with right parties wanting to organize their allies in the business community and forming strong business associations. But the point I want to make here is the kind of associations that develop have a big impact on social investment. So in the book that I wrote that came out in 2012, which is from what some of this our discussion is based, there are three kinds of groups. And at the very highest level, you have what we call macro-corporatist groups. And these are the groups that you find in the Nordic countries, where you get big business and big labor organized in sort of different stages. So the bottom level stage may be industrial, and then the next stage up you have the whole industrial sector, manufacturing, negotiating with the whole retail level, and then a peak association at the top. And so the peak business association negotiates with the peak labor association. And what that means is that they can decide policy through collective bargaining channels, through tripartite negotiations. And only a few policies are actually decided in parliaments. And what that means is that business and labor develop a kind of ownership over public policy because they're so instrumental in helping to figure out what public policy should be. In some countries, they develop royal commissions where they ask representatives from these different groups to come together and figure out how to proceed. So in the Netherlands, they solved their childcare problem by forming a royal commission in the 1970s, and everybody sat down and they talked about it for several years. And at the end of this period, they decided what childcare policy they should have. And everybody owned it. Everybody was part of the process. So these three kinds of groups have really different implications for equality. So highly organized business, the macro-corporatist ones, are linked to greater social spending and higher levels of equality for several reasons. One is they solve a collective action problem. So it's very difficult for individual firms to act on their own when they may be punished for it. So if Professor Wilkinson, for example, is a good guy, and he's investing heavily in his workers, and he's giving them training, and you're being really good, very, very, very nice behavior. I come along, I'm the bad guy, and I say, hey, you're a well-trained worker. I'm going to pay you a lot more than Wilkinson can pay you because I haven't invested in training. And that's part of the reason why training is severely underprovided in the United States. So that solves a collective action problem in that the association develops training protocols and asks all of its members to comply and does a lot of that internally. It also has cognitive effects. So groups channel information. When you have a regular forum where you bring together business and labor and state policymakers, they exchange ideas. They start talking the same language. So when I did a study of American employers in national health reform, I met this one woman and she says, I'm a conservative on all issues, but on this I'm a bleeding liberal. I think she meant bleeding heart liberal. But the point was she was meeting in these groups and over time came to share language and understanding with them. So it was a matter of kind of building consensus together. Now finally, it has political economic effects because when you have high levels of coordination where wages are developed at a high level, it prevents strikes. You have very few strikes in these countries. It prevents groups of workers demanding much higher wages above what productivity growth rates might allow for. And also you have some wage compression where you try to elevate the skills of the least skilled workers. Now, I did a study of active labor market policies in Britain and the United Kingdom. And this was, what I did is I took a sample of 107 randomly selected firms of the Fortune 200 companies in the two countries. And I went around, it was a real road trip research project. In fact, I say I'll never do another one of these because at some point in the project, I had to hitchhike because my transportation broke down, and I'm just too old to get picked up. So this is the end of my research projects, road trip interviewing firms, but I've moved on to other methods. So in this, I asked firms all sorts of questions about their decision to participate in these training programs for the long-term unemployed. And I want to make it clear that on paper, what the Danes came up with and what the Brits came up with were very similar policies. They wanted active labor market policies to cut benefits for the long-term unemployed. They wanted to push everybody off unemployment, but they wanted to give them training and jobs. And it was really important that employers get involved because they wanted to give them real jobs. The ideas came from both the left and the right, so it wasn't a particularly ideological approach. And Denmark and Britain had really similar programs, same kinds of employer subsidies. What's interesting is the Danes participated significantly more than the Brits. There was a huge difference. So in Denmark, 63% of the Danish firms participated. In Britain, 40% of the firms participated. The firms in Denmark were much more enthusiastic about the programs than the firms in Britain. They knew much more about the programs than the firms in Britain, and different kinds of firms participated. So one thing I found really interesting is that the firms got their ideas from very different places. In Denmark, a lot of firms got their major source of ideas was from their employers' organization, so 31% of Danish firms listed that as the #1 source, and a bunch of firms said that was the second source, and the first source was the state. In Britain, only 14% of the firms got them from employers' associations. Instead, British firms largely got their ideas from articles, newspapers, maybe the trade press, or the internet. In other words, there was no concentrated way for the associations or the state to reach these business managers and to help cultivate ideas among them. The motivations for participation were also extremely different. So you have to remember at this time, Denmark and Britain have exactly the same vacancy rates. Danish workers are actually more skilled than British workers. They have higher levels of skills. And nonetheless, 31% of the Danish firms said they participated because they wanted to get access to a new labor pool. And they thought these programs were going to give them that. 51% said that they felt a sense of social responsibility. So the government and their employers' associations made this into a national campaign to end unemployment, to get people off the dole, to get the long-term unemployed back into the labor force. In fact, there was a concept called den rummelige arbeidsmarked, which means the encompassing labor market, the encompassing economy. And so what they tried to do is stretch the economy so that every worker had a job. One of my favorite trips was to a place that made pumps. And this place had a program where workers would put little round rubbers onto the pipes of the pumps. Now, these were people who were mentally challenged. They didn't have very high IQs. They couldn't work in the regular job. And so they created a program for these people where the state paid part of their salary and the firm paid part of their salary. And everybody was a winner. The people got a place to work. The state had to pay half of the subsidy, half of the social support that it would pay otherwise, and the firm got workers who could do unproductive jobs. And so they have a lot of those kinds of things in Denmark where they try to find ways that everybody's a winner. Now in Britain, why did firms participate? Well, 31% said they participated because Tony Blair called up the CEOs, invited them down to 10 Downing Street and said, "We need you to do this." In fact, another difference was that in Denmark, a lot of the decisions were made by personnel and human resource managers, whereas in Britain, the decisions were made by the CEO at the top, and there was very little follow-through to the real economic needs of the firm. They also participated because of political pressures, other kinds of political pressures, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. In Britain, the type of firms that participated were ones with big sales to the public sector. And so as one guy who worked in one of these firms said to me, we sell a lot to government. If Tony Blair wants us to do this, we're going to have to play ball. In Denmark, it tended to be small firms, blue-collar firms who belonged to a business association. In Britain, they were extremely low-skilled workers who did not belong to a business association. Now, I also found that this impact of employer organization was important at national levels of active labor market policy training. So the final thing I want to talk about is how coordination helps renewal, economic renewal. Countries do go off track. Even the Nordic countries go off track. But I would suggest to you that coordination helps countries figure out ways to develop economic recovery. So before the financial crisis, many countries deregulated finance and housing. Even the coordinated countries like Denmark and the Netherlands ran extremely high debt equity ratios. They deregulated their mortgage markets. They were hit hard by the crisis. There were very slow growth rates, high unemployment, less social solidarity. But the Nordic countries rebounded very quickly. First of all, they very quickly re-regulated their housing policies. So they realized that neoliberalism was a mistake, and they decided they were going to fix it. They also started cutting back the financial sectors. So it's very interesting. Denmark had the manufacturing share of the economy of value added was about 11%. In 2010, it went up to 15% by 2016, and they're continuing to beef that up. They use coordination to protect their workers. So they did this thing where they created job sharing where workers would work 2 out of 3 weeks so they didn't have to lay people off. They shared the burden. They also used coordination to try to move into new green technologies. And this has been a tremendous success story in these countries. They tried to restructure their economies. They realized that higher levels of social investment are possible with an export-oriented, high-skilled growth model. So rather than competing on price, firms compete on quality, and in that way can sustain higher levels. So they use new value-added sectors to try to sustain their welfare states. And if you look at the profile of these Nordic countries today, they're all doing really well in green technologies. In Norway, renewables provide 98% of all energy. In Denmark, renewables were 44%, even without hydroelectric power. These are magnets for jobs. Job growth has been 6 times as high in these new sectors as in the economy overall. So it's really impressive. This slide shows that out of the top 8 countries in renewable energy, the Nordics are 5 of them. Now, I finally want to conclude with the lessons for the Republic of Korea, because I think that all countries can't be the Nordic countries, but all have traditions of coordination. And so my view of Korea is that historically, under the authoritarian regime, the Korean miracle involved the developmental economy and developmental welfare state with supportive employers. Social protections and functional equivalents for long-term skills were developed. And then what you see happening was a turn to neoliberalism, something that happens all over the world. And the turn to neoliberalism is partly motivated by deindustrialization, by globalization. It's much harder to reconcile skills gaps when you have a lot of people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom. And that was a problem because it got Korea off track. So I think a lot of the problems you're facing today with non-standard workers and with this incredible inequality has to do with the fact that you adopted policies that worked against you. And the government now has a desire to build an inclusive nation, and I think it's a great idea. I really do. I think they're on the right track. It remains to be seen if you can get the political will to do that, and I'd like to talk more about that in the question and answer period. But I just want to conclude by saying that I think the Nordic experience can be of help here. It can be of help not only in knowing what to do, but in presenting a case to employers that maybe this is a good idea. So attack inequality with programs of social investment. Now, that doesn't mean you just do everything on the supply side. You also need demand side policies. So enlarging the public sector would also be a very good way to go. Strengthen institutions for collective industrial relations. You have tripartite organization in place. The Economic, Social, and Labor Council was created in 1998, or its predecessor was created then, and it's evolved since then. So strengthen those associations for coordination. Work with collective business to advance new growth strategies. Let business be partners in this project. Create institutions where you bring together business and labor, and you ask them to start thinking about how to solve the problem. Don't let them just say no to everything. Ask employers to take a more predominant role in this process. Collectivism helps countries to respond to a globalized world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Martin, for some lights of hope and also your guide to social investment with the example of the Nordic experience. 다시 한번 강연해 주신 마틴 교수님께 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.